The cold bit into my skin like needles. I tried to wrap the towel tighter around me, but it did little to stop the freezing air from creeping in. I couldn't believe what had just happened. Locked in this old, drafty bathroom by my mother-in-law, Elizabeth, I felt more trapped than ever. I banged on the door again, my hands numb from the cold. "Elizabeth, please, let me out," I shouted, desperation thick in my voice. But there was no response. She had locked me in, stormed off, and left me here. Just like that. How could she? I thought bitterly. All I wanted was to clean myself up after a long, exhausting day. But instead, I was shivering, alone, and afraid. And where was John? My husband should have been the first to help me, to get me out of this mess. I pulled my phone out with shaky hands and dialed his number. After a few rings, he picked up, his voice thick with sleep. "John, help. Your mom locked me in the bathroom. I'm freezing." There was a pause, then the most shocking words spilled out. "It's your own fault. You're always complaining about something," he said with a groan. "Just deal with it. You're not dying." I stared at the phone in disbelief. The cold that gripped my body had nothing on the chill his words sent down my spine. Was this really the man I married? How had I ended up in this situation, isolated and trapped, with the people who were supposed to be my family treating me like I didn't matter? As I sat on the cold floor, waiting for morning to come, my mind wandered back to how it all began. My name is Kate, and I'm 33 years old. I work a typical office job in the city, nothing special, but I've always been proud of the life I've built for myself. 2 years ago, I met John through a mutual friend. He was quiet, but smart, with a dry sense of humor that drew me in. He wasn't like the other guys I'd dated. There was a mystery to him, a calmness that made me feel safe. We dated for a year before he proposed, and I said yes, without hesitation. At the time, everything seemed perfect. I didn't see the red flags, at least not clearly enough to stop me from moving forward. It wasn't until after the wedding that I started noticing things about John that troubled me. He was frugal to an extreme. He wore the same old clothes, refused to buy anything new, and always commented on how I spent money. "Why do you need a new phone?" he asked me once, his tone sharp. "It still works, doesn't it? You shouldn't waste money when something isn't broken." At first, I brushed it off as him being practical, but soon it became clear that he wasn't just careful. He was controlling. He even held onto his old, stretched-out clothes with a sense of pride. "It's still good," he'd say, as if refusing to replace things made him morally superior. Even though we had our differences, I told myself that marriage was about compromise. I tried to adapt, to find middle ground. But when it came to visiting his family, I began to feel trapped. John's family lived far from the city, in a small, run-down house that looked like it had been abandoned years ago. The first time I saw it, I couldn't hide my shock. "This place? Can people really live here?" I asked John as we pulled up in front of the crumbling building. The walls were covered in creeping vines, and the windows were either broken or patched with cardboard. It looked more like a haunted house than a home. "It's old, but it's fine," John replied casually, like he hadn't noticed the decay around us. Inside, things weren't much better. The floorboards creaked with every step, and the air smelled musty, like the house hadn't been aired out in years. His parents, Daniel and Elizabeth, greeted us with smiles, but something about the place made me uneasy. Still, I did my best to be polite. I wanted to make a good impression on John's family, even if their home made me feel uncomfortable. As the months went by, though, I found myself dreading every visit. Elizabeth had a way of looking down on me, like I didn't quite measure up to her expectations. One day, after a long summer had passed, and the cold winds of autumn began creeping in, John told me we were going back to his parents' place for Thanksgiving. I felt my stomach twist at the thought, but I agreed. It was the right thing to do, after all. But as we arrived, That familiar sense of dread washed over me. Elizabeth greeted us at the door, her smile thin and sharp. "Kate, it's so good to see you again," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. The house was just as cold and uncomfortable as ever. This time, however, the unease was even stronger. Something was different, and I could feel it in the way Elizabeth looked at me. The day dragged on, with awkward small talk and forced smiles. John seemed oblivious to the tension, chatting casually with his father about mundane things, while I felt like a stranger in their world. After dinner, Elizabeth suddenly insisted that I help her clean up. Logically, even though I had already offered earlier. Something about her felt off, but I went along with it, hoping to avoid any more friction. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Elizabeth came to me with a strange expression on her face. "Kate, why don't you take a bath before bed? You must be tired," she suggested, her voice too sweet, too forced. I hesitated. The bathhouse was outside, a small old shed that they used for bathing, because the house itself didn't have a proper bathroom. It was strange, and the idea of stepping out into the freezing night didn't appeal to me, but I agreed, hoping it would get Elizabeth off my back. The bathhouse was freezing, with no proper insulation to block the cold. I hurried inside, hoping to get through the ordeal quickly. But as soon as I stepped into the small, dimly lit space, I heard it. The sound of a lock clicking into place. My heart skipped a beat. "Elizabeth?" I called out, but there was no response. I tried the door. It wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I realized what had happened. She had locked me in. I banged on the door, shouting for help, but the only sound that filled the night was the howling wind. Hours passed. I tried calling John, but his response crushed whatever hope I had left. He was supposed to protect me, to care about me. Instead, he dismissed my cries for help as though they were nothing more than complaints. As the night dragged on, I thought about all the small moments that led up to this. The times when John's indifference toward me had been apparent. The times Elizabeth had subtly undermined me. The way the house itself seemed to reflect their coldness. But I wasn't ready for what would happen the next morning. When the sun finally rose, I was exhausted, both mentally and physically. I had barely slept, my body numb from the cold. When I finally heard the sound of footsteps approaching, I hoped it was John coming to let me out. Instead, I was greeted by chaos. Police cars and ambulances had swarmed the property, their lights flashing in the early morning light. Elizabeth was wrapped in a blanket, shivering, as if she had spent the night in the cold herself. But that didn't make sense. I was the one who had been locked in the bathroom, not her. As I stumbled out of the bathhouse, confused and disoriented, John rushed toward me, his face pale with panic. "Kate, where were you? What happened?" Before I could answer, Elizabeth pointed at me, her eyes filled with accusation. "She's the one who locked me in," she screamed. I stared at her, unable to comprehend what she was saying. How could she accuse me of something like that when she was the one who had trapped me in the freezing cold? The next few hours were a blur. The police questioned me, trying to piece together what had happened. Elizabeth had been found locked in the bathroom, just like I had been. But at some point during the night, she claimed I had done it to her. It didn't make sense. None of it did. But then John did something I hadn't expected. He confessed. "I thought it was Kate," he said, his voice trembling. "I thought she had gotten out, so I locked the door as a punishment. I didn't know my mom was inside." The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. John had done this. He had locked Elizabeth in the bathroom, thinking it was me. He had wanted to punish me, to teach me some sort of twisted lesson. And in the process, he had nearly destroyed both of us. The police didn't arrest John, though they should have. His parents, desperate to protect their son, tried to shift the blame onto me. But the truth was out. Elizabeth's spiteful accusations couldn't cover up what really happened, and John's guilt was plain for everyone to see. I stood there, numb, as everything unraveled around me. This family, the people who were supposed to be my new family, had turned against me in the most vicious way possible. But as much as they tried to blame me, they couldn't erase the truth. John had done this, and I knew, in that moment, that I had to leave. It took months to finalize the divorce. John begged me to stay, apologizing over and over again, but I couldn't. I had seen the truth of who he was, and there was no going back. The incident with the bathhouse was the final straw, but the cracks in our relationship had been there long before that night. I moved back to the city, back to the life I had before John. It wasn't easy to start over, but I did. Slowly, I rebuilt my life, finding comfort in the familiarity of my old routines. I met new people, made new friends, and eventually I found someone who truly cared about me. Years later, I'm happy again. I've remarried, and my new husband is everything John wasn't: kind, supportive, and loving. We have a beautiful daughter, and our life is filled with warmth and laughter. But sometimes, when I think back to that night in the bathhouse, I feel a chill run down my spine. It's a reminder of how close I came to losing myself in a toxic relationship, how easily things can spiral out of control when the people around you don't care. One morning, as I sat with my family watching the news, a familiar image flashed across the screen. A powerful hurricane had swept through John's hometown, leaving destruction in its wake. The camera panned over the wreckage, and there it was. John's family home, the place where it all began, completely destroyed. I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of closure. The house, once so cold and oppressive, was gone. The past was finally behind me. My husband noticed my reaction and asked if I was okay. I smiled, the weight of my past finally lifting off my shoulders. "It's nothing," I said, wrapping my arms around my daughter. "Just a bad memory."